Our next discussant, Josh Harden, Texas A&M graduate student, unfortunately couldn't make it to the conference today, and he sent me his presentation and his notes, and I'm going to read it for you. Warwick artifact assemblage. This includes primarily everything else except armament, rigging, and some selected artifacts that we have other presentation on. Aside from the most important artifact of the project, the hull itself, Warwick had about more than 600 individual artifacts, which we categorize in 6 major groups. 3 largest categories included wood. The majority of wood recovered was related to the ship structure. However, here we'll focus on cargo-related artifacts, mostly tobacco-related objects, barrel and cask fragments, and some decorations. Metals, these include iron and lead objects. Due to the way the iron corrodes underwater, forming a thick layer of concretion, this presentation will cover only the artifacts that were already deconcreted and partly at least conserved and could be analyzed. And the third largest, or the second actually, with 22%, other organics other than wood. This category includes mostly bones, but also in this presentation, caulking samples that we took from the ship and analyzed will be included. 3 smaller categories: stone and bricks artifacts, mostly ballast stones, coal and bricks. Then glass and ceramics. We recovered hundreds of tiny little shards of ceramics, and a few scraps of leather, less than 1% of the entire assemblage. First category, stone and bricks. All of the coal that we found on the site was completely mixed with the ballast rocks of the ship. This could be, of course, accidental, but also it could have been done on purpose. The analysis of the coal from the work showed that it was a high-quality type called anthracite, also known as the stone coal, which is the highest quality of mineral coal. We know that coal became quite popular in England as early as 16th century, though the references to mining and trading go much earlier. Now, how this coal got into the ballast? According to the Act of Parliament from 1563, late 16th century, there was a ban on shipment of coal outside Britain. The penalty for this was seizure of ship and all the goods on board. This led to some merchants mixing coal with ballast to avoid the law. Coal shipment taxes were also increased throughout the 16th and 17th century, and obviously everyone likes to avoid paying taxes. This could also lead to hiding coal in ballast of the ship to avoid paying much higher rates. Coal would have been very important commodity in Bermuda, given the lack of natural resources. And I remember that on one of the exhibits, Dr. Harris excavated forts in Bermuda, and one of the exhibits actually outside Castle, King's Castle, there was a pocket of coal, and it was dated on the exhibit, I remember, 1630 to 40, which is only 10 years, perhaps 10, 20 years after the war. So it's highly probable that a lot of ships that were coming to Bermuda were bringing coal, and to avoid paying higher taxes, mixing coal with ballast. Another category, bricks. The brick fragments we recovered are typical of the period. The brick could have been part of the structure, such as an oven in the galley, or simply put on board for ballast. Some of the broken pieces were likely used as ballast or mixed with ballast, with some other larger, more intact bricks coming from the hearth. The size of the pieces recovered ranged from few centimeters to the smallest to 14, 17 centimeters, the largest. The red color is very common for early 17th century bricks, and is a transition from Tudor bricks making that is much lighter in color. Similar bricks were recovered from other mid-17th century shipwrecks like Cromwellian off Duart Point in Mull. wood artifacts. 4 cedar pins were found during the 2011 field season, indicating that at least some of the tobacco was already on board, or perhaps left on board when the warrig was moored for the approaching storm. Perhaps it was a personal possession of the crew, as we know that crew was exchanging their supply of aquavita for tobacco with local Bermudians. Tobacco went through the intense process before it could be shipped. First, it had to be harvested, then cured, consolidated, and then finally packaged. After curing, the leaves would be removed from the stalks, piled together, and braided into ropes in a traditional Spanish style. And then the cedar pins would be inserted into these ropes to hold them together for shipping. And tobacco didn't survive, although we took several organic samples, and we hope that analysis will turn out and will prove that some of the brown stuff could potentially be tobacco, but we definitely know that cedar pins were already present. As far as barrel staves, numerous broken pieces of wood barrel staves and barrel or cask staves were also recovered. Some of these staves were found in pockets mixed with animal bones, indicating that they could have been provisioned, perhaps. Dendroanalysis of a few selected pieces, as we already heard from Nigel, indicated that there were at least 2 different types on board. Some of the timbers were French oak, some other were Baltic oak. The Baltic oak could have been quite common in England at this time, as there was a timber trade, extensive timber trade between England and Poland. It could also be, as Nigel suggested, maybe herrings from the Baltic for the voyage. There are also some staves with distinct markings, there the picture on the bottom, such as 2 overlapping circles. Though the marking has deteriorated, it can still be seen. The marking could signify either the maker's mark, makers of the barrel, or the content. Barrel hoops and withies. During the early 17th century, casks were still constructed with wooden barrel hoops. The hoops were tied together with withies, which were generally made out of willow stems. On the work, we found mostly short fragments of hoops with 1 fragment, actually 2 fragments, of the overlap secured with a small wooden peg and then tied with a withy. A single intact headpiece, barrel headpiece, was also recovered. It was just 1 single board. The head was beveled, had bevel ends to fit into the crows. Once more analysis are done, it could be determined whether this piece was part of a wet cask or dry cask. Along both edges, on both sides, this piece has evidence of small dowels which secured this board to the next one. As part of the research, Josh want to recreate the diameter of the head and potentially calculate or compare with other material, recreate the whole barrel in rhino and calculate the capacity. We found several stoppers, likely for barrels or casks carrying beer or wine or some other foodstuff. Barrels of beer are specifically referenced in the first-hand accounts by Governor Butler himself as being salvaged from the work immediately after the wrecking. The corks could have been used for various ceramic vessels. The railing piece, this is one of our most interesting artifacts, since the upper portion of any shipwrecks normally don't really survive. This is an important piece that relate to the potential ship decorations. We have very little evidence of decorations, and this is our only artifact that could potentially pinpoint some decorative elements. Unfortunately, this artifact was not attached to any hull fragment, but found a few meters off the site in deep sediment, and more research into historical and iconographical sources needs to be done to find similarities or parallels for this piece. Perhaps we should look at Vasa and Mary Rose and see where this element could fit. Now, metal artifacts. Metal lead straps or tingles. Tingles are fairly common on shipwrecks. There are at least several parallels, including the Bermudan shipwreck Sea Venture. Here on the Warwick, we found various lengths and sizes. They would have been used to patch leaks or interior, exterior, or just along the deck of the ship. Although very heavily deteriorated and concreted, we also discovered a gudgeon strap. Such gudgeon strap is part of the rudder assembly and could possibly be used in the future to determine the size of the Warwick or help to narrow down together with the hull remains. Rudders were made in a similar fashion to doors of the period. The gudgeons would accept the pintle strap. The pintle would be the male part, which acted as a hinge for the rudder to move left and right, or the port or starboard side of the ship. We also found two padlocks representing two distinct designs in padlocks used during the 17th century, the bowl lock and the square lock. The bowl lock came into prominence during the first half of the 17th century, but these type of locks also could be found as late as 1730. An almost identical bowl lock was discovered on the Sea Venture. Towards the end of 17th century, the square or heart-shaped lock appeared and started to replace the bowl locks. The heart-shaped lock was broader than it was taller, and despite being called heart-shaped, had more a handbag shape into it. And perhaps with the Warwick being properly dated and confirmed, we can push the date from late 17th century to early 17th century for this type of padlocks. As far as other concretions, right at the stern there was also the circular object embedded into the plank. From stories from Teddy Tucker, who originally salvaged the shipwreck, we knew that there was a section of the ship that apparently had a cannonball embedded into the hull and then patched. And we thought that this might be this concretion, but we lifted and there was no hull underneath. So definitely it was just concretion that was just after years underwater just got embedded into the planking. In addition to this piece, we found numerous other concretions. However, these need to be conserved and then later fully assessed and studied. Now the next category, glass and ceramics. Most of the ceramics are too small to be identified or to be even diagnostic. The color of the fragments ranged from red to gray, and when some pieces had still remnants of various glazes, the majority, however, can be simply defined as common redware. Several pieces had yellowish green to green glaze and could potentially be fragments of Surreyware that were common from 1590 to 1640. Examples of green glazed ceramics have been found on numerous other 16th and 17th century shipwrecks, including Sea Venture, but also Spanish small vessel Western Ledge Reef wreck, which also sank at the end of 16th century in Bermuda. So this type is quite common. There were also a few pieces, including a possible handle fragment, which had a black glaze. English earthenware with black glaze was fairly common before 1640, but more analysis needs to be done to determine what type of ceramics were carried on board Warwick. And the difficult part is that because everything was mixed with the ballast, it's a lot of times it's difficult to assess which is actually ceramics that could have been on board and which was just mixed with the ballast and it was just garbage. As far as pipes, we found almost intact, two pipes and several stems. Their design can be matched to Noel Hume's English pipe typology, type 6, but also type 4. Both of these types fall between 1610 and 1640, which is contemporary with the date of the wrecking. Unfortunately, there are no maker's marks on any of the pipes to directly identify their date or origin. Pipes could have been on board for trade, but also could have been items for the crew, very common. The tobacco used in trade was really starting to gather steam during the early 17th century, but the small quantities found on the Warwick perhaps pinpoint towards personal possession of the crew rather than commercial purposes. And it is at this point we know that Warwick didn't have any cargo when it sunk. We found records that all the cargo was removed. So definitely the tobacco and pipes was most likely personal possession of the crew members that stayed behind. Other organics. Altogether, we found more than 130 bone fragments ranging in size from a couple of centimeters to almost 20 centimeters. Various species are present. The majority of bones represent large domestic mammals, such as cows, but also pigs, also some fish and rodents. Most of the large bones that we found were in pockets mixed with broken barrel fragments and hoops, indicating perhaps that this was the ship's provision, perhaps salted beef or salted meat stored in barrels inside the hold of the ship that wasn't removed before the hurricane. We found a lot of rib bones. Those are probably the most common type that we found. As far as other artifacts made of bone, we found 2 fragments of combs. Though little of them survived, there are likely hair combs used to remove lice. Hair combs were double-sided, with one side having teeth close together and the other side having them further apart. Though only one side has still teeth in place. On the opposite side, we see the small indentations and regular intervals, most likely where originally the teeth were present. And finally, based, as I mentioned in my presentation about the ship's structure, Warwick had 2 layers of external planking and the 3rd layer of sheathing, sacrificial sheathing. Each of these layers was separated from the next one with a thick layer of caulking material. This level of protection of the ship was nothing unusual, but rather a common practice for the time for all the ships destined for warm tropical waters as a measure against torpedo worms. Each season, in 2001, 2010, 2011, and 12, more caulking samples were collected everywhere where we could see caulking or we had access to the external planking. We were trying to collect samples. And some of them, most of the samples at this point, were already analyzed. Based on these analyses, the caulking was made of 2 components. One was tar, which was actually made of pine resin, and the other component was hair. What is interesting is that in 2012, we also discovered a large chunk of pine resin on the site. The resin was likely on board for ship repairs and used in conjunction with lead tingles to patch leaks, perhaps. It could also be used, if such need arose, to produce tar for the ship. At this point, we still have to test and compare if this is the same pine rosin that our tar was made of, which will tell us if this is maybe the same source. The hair portion of the caulking gave 2 different results. Most of the samples were likely bovine. This is very common as ships use cows, sheep, or goat, or horse hair for caulking material, so cow's hair used on the Warwick is nothing unusual. However, one sample came back as deer hair, Cervus species, most likely English red deer. This is extremely unusual and could be the first example, to my knowledge at least, of deer hair being used as caulking material for the ship. It was actually, the sample came from between the 2nd layer of planking and sheathing. More caulking samples, we decided to take more caulking samples during the last season in 2012, and are now being in the process of being analyzed. More information will be available once these analyses are completed. We want to find out if the entire 2nd layer of caulking was deer, or this is just a small patch, because it's so unusual, and the amount of deer hair that you need to caulk such ship would be incredible. but more testing is needed to answer this question. As far as preliminary conclusions, generally speaking, there are no surprises here. The artifact assemblage from the work supports the early 17th century dating of the site. Many of these artifacts found on the work have known parallels and further our understanding of early 17th century products shipped to the colonies and back, as well as personal possession of crew members. Other artifacts are unique, for example, the curved piece of railing or the deer hair for caulking, and have raised more questions than answers. Overall, we still have to continue our analysis and research, and hopefully with the thesis that Josh is currently writing, we'll have some more answers in the future. Thank you.